And joining us now, senior animal protein analyst with Rabobank, Christine McCracken is with us. Christine, great to have you join the show today. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I am good. Thank you for the time. We are talking about a new report from Rabobank, the Global Pork Quarterly, the quarter three 2022 report. And Christine, we look at the first half of the year, pork, we've seen a bit of a decline, it feels like, in pork exports here globally. And let's look at the second half. What are you guys seeing in this report looking at quarter three? Are we going to see the global outlook pick up for pork exports, et cetera? Talk to us a little bit about this report.
Well, I think if you look at the global supply and demand, we are a little tight in supply around the world. We've had obviously some contraction in the European markets that really reflects ongoing issues with ASF and some of the concerns there, some ongoing disease issues in parts of it, and really some really rough profit, like a really tough profit outlook for them. So they've been uh, reducing their herds, and that's left the global market a little short. At the same time as China's reopened, it's created some incremental demand. So I think if you look on balance, we're really looking at a much better trade outlook, maybe for the second half. But there's still a lot of economic pressure that could impact that. So it's tough to say with certainty, but it sure looks like we're looking at a much better trade outlook for the second half.
Well, when we think about the trade outlook, I know producers are looking at a bit of lessening pressure when it comes to feed costs, energy costs here, not just in the U.S. but globally. What are your thoughts there? Is some of that to decrease pressure? Is that going to have an impact as well?
Well, I do think that it's helping, but it's at historic highs in any case. It's not as though we're going back to what we have enjoyed in the past few years. So I do think the volatility is creating some concern when you think through energy costs in Europe, for example. This winter are going to be really crazy. If you think through even these exports out of the Ukraine, I think you're talking about just an extreme amount of uncertainty, and that's, I think, at times a bit tough to plan around, but generally should be a bit better here at home as we think through our cost outlook. So maybe adding a little bit of optimism there as well.
Well, let's talk a little more about China. You mentioned that China's pork imports, I believe, according to the report, down 65% year over year. And we look at China, not just U.S. relations, but just global outlook. What is China looking at for pork imports here in quarter three and in the second half of 2022? Are we going to see China start to import more pork or not?
Well, that's a million or billion-dollar question. Hundreds of millions. I think there's still no one knows for sure. I think that's all we do know. But what we have seen is increased interest from China in buying pork and other proteins, but primarily going to other countries. A lot of European exporters, for example, is they don't face the same trade barriers that the U.S. does. When you think through kind of the current situation, I think that's probably adding a little pressure to that outlook. But as we think through China's needs, again, as they reopen and they have really brought down their inventories, they're going to need to go to that global market for supply. And I think that at present, that's probably going to be in Europe, possibly some out of Canada. They've just approved 3 additional pork plants for export. That's positive for them. And then if you think through, Brazil is a likely supplier. All of that's good news, though, for the U.S. as we think through, the markets that would have been met with that supply had it not been for China. And that creates some opportunities maybe for the second half for U.S. exporters.
Yeah, maybe a bit of a reshuffling of the deck chairs, so to speak, when it comes to trade globally. You alluded to this as well. I know the U.S.-China tensions over Taiwan. I think this just coming to the forefront here after you guys have put out this report. But obviously, on the U.S. side, one has to wonder. There's just a lot of uncertainty surrounding that right now. It appears, Christine.
Yeah, and it's hard to predict how that will play out. I think that if you think through kind of where we are right now, I'd suspect that we don't look for a lot of incremental demand coming out of China, and maybe even some pushback on product that they had been taking. They've been a significant variety meat market for us, and maybe that slows down some given some of this tension. But in the grand scheme of things, it is one global market, so you do have these puts and takes that ultimately work out.
Well, on the U.S. side, a little bit more. Let's talk about that. I know for U.S. pork exports, Mexico has continued to be a top buyer of ours. The June hogs and pigs report, the U.S. sow herd was 0.8% below year ago levels. And I think that points to some of that tightening of pork supplies. Talk about the U.S. outlook. What are some other things that stand out to you from this new Rabobank report?
Yeah, if you really look at our slaughter levels lately, we have been killing a little below maybe what that hogs and pigs report might have suggested. I think that's been obviously very supportive to the market. The question from here forward is will we need to revise those numbers, or do we get back to kind of an expected level of slaughter, and maybe a little bit of incremental pressure on the market as we move forward. I am still fairly optimistic that the report is fairly accurate. So we likely will see a few more pigs come to market here through the second half. But again, it's all about the demand, really, both in the U.S., which continues to be very good. I think that the retail channel has been very supportive to pork prices overall, and maybe with a little less pork being imported, should stay pretty strong, I think, with bellies and hams really driving the value of that carcass, and really thinking through, what we think of as fairly strong demand still out of Mexico. I think we'll have a fairly good, rest of the year as we think through pork values.
Well, and you mentioned demand as well, and consumer demand plays into that. Obviously, inflation, a recession, et cetera, is a big part of the market trade right now and our economy and our everyday life. But I think that's pointing us to more pork at the grocery store as well. It's kind of the cheaper protein of everything. It seems when we go to the meat counter right now, Christine.
Well, you can always find good value in pork. I think that has been a good place for consumers to look for high quality protein over the last several months, and it's shown up in the sales data. Really strong demand across the board as we've gone through the summer months, and part of that has been supply, as we mentioned. But you think through, what we've seen over COVID and really over the past year when it comes to retail sales is consumers maybe cut back on their food service spending and look at retail as a better alternative. I think pork is always finds a good place at the center of the plate in terms of value. And I do think that the retail channel has been relatively supportive on bacon featuring. If you think through the summer months, it's been bringing successfully bringing consumers into the store. And I think that as a result, you've seen really good sales through that retail channel. I think that'll maybe slow down a bit as we head into the fall, but I do think that we'll continue to see fairly steady takeaway in that channel.
And Christine, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about African swine fever and its impact on the trade. And now we continue to watch cases in Europe, Asia, in like the Dominican Republic. We haven't seen anything confirmed in the United States yet, thankfully. But I know it's top of mind for hog producers here across the U.S. As you look at the ASF situation globally, what stands out to you, and what did you guys find in this new report?
Well, I do think the biggest development lately has been this continued spread throughout Europe, to the border with the Netherlands, throughout Italy. So you've seen some fairly sizable contraction in that market as a result, as they've been unable to move product maybe into export channels as they had been historically, but also creating some additional angst as it gets very close to other production regions in France and the Netherlands. So it's really, I think, when you look forward, it's really all about, would you be expanding production maybe in some of those regions where it's a real threat when it's on your doorstep? Generally, probably not. And at the same time, you're probably looking to maybe bring inventories down. When it hits in your region, essentially you're really cut off from exports. And I think that we've seen additional selling pressure maybe out of some regions of Europe as a result.
Well, Christine, fantastic stuff. Before we run out of time, any other final thoughts you want to mention? Anything else that we haven't touched on here today?
Well, I think there's always, when it comes to geopolitics, there's a lot we can't predict. So I think given that we do sell as much as a third of our pork into these channels, it continues to be maybe the hardest part of the story to predict. But I think the good news is that our domestic markets and the markets nearby, Mexico and Canada, remain very steady. I think in that regard, we're looking for a fairly optimistic outlook in the second half.
Well, we will post a link to this new report from Rabobank on our website, and we appreciate the time and the analysis with that senior animal protein analyst with Rabobank, Christine McCracken. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll hopefully talk to you again soon.
Thanks.